The outlaw was starving, down to nothing but a crust of bread. Yet when he found a wounded Apache warrior gasping for life beneath the desert sun, he placed that last piece of food in the man's trembling hand. By dawn, the price of mercy revealed itself. Hoofbeats thundered across the canyon. Dust rose like storm clouds. 500 Apache riders closed in on his camp, circling, silent, eyes burning with fire. One small act of kindness had summoned an army. But was it to destroy him or to change his fate forever? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. Jonas had been running for weeks, the law and his sins riding his heels harder than any posse. And now, in the blistering desert, his body had begun to betray him. His lips cracked, his tongue felt like leather, and his belly growled with a hollow ache that made his knees weak beneath him. All he had left was a single crust of bread, hard as stone, clutched in his shaking hand like a relic from a better life. He told himself he would savor it in silence, break it with trembling fingers, and hold off death for one more hour. But fate led his boots to a sight that rooted him where he stood. Beneath the brutal sun lay an Apache warrior, Dakota, sprawled across the sand with blood staining the earth around him. His chest rose shallowly, his eyes flickered half-closed. Yet when they met Jonas's, they sparked with the last embers of defiance, as though daring him to finish what bullet or blade had started. Jonas's breath caught, because everything he had been taught on the frontier told him an Apache was an enemy, a savage to be feared, and that sparing him could mean certain death. But as he looked closer, the defiance in Dakota's gaze melted into something human, something desperate, an unspoken plea from one dying man to another. Jonas crouched slowly, the desert wind tugging at his ragged coat, and stared at the crust in his palm. He thought of the men he had killed, the banks he had robbed, the lives he had broken in his flight from law and conscience alike. Each memory weighed heavier than the revolver at his hip, and in that weight he felt a strange clarity. Here lay a man on the edge of death, not so different from himself, and for once, Jonas could choose to do something other than take. The bread crumbled slightly in his grip, a meager offering against the vast hunger gnawing at his own ribs, but when he pressed it into Dakota's trembling hand, he felt as though he had placed the whole of his battered soul there too. Dakota's lips moved, silent at first, then parted enough to accept the dry morsel. His teeth scraped it, his throat worked with pain, and his eyes never left Jonas's face as if trying to understand why mercy had come from the barrel of despair. The air seemed to grow still, the desert's endless hum pausing in reverence, and Jonas, for the first time in years, felt the sharp sting of tears behind his eyes. He did not know if the act would save the man's life, or condemn his own when others came seeking vengeance. But he knew it was the first decision he had made in years that wasn't carved from selfishness. In that moment, beneath the blazing sky, outlaw and warrior became bound not by hatred, but by a crust of bread shared in the dust, a fragile bridge across a canyon of blood and history. Night came creeping over the desert like a slow tide of ink, swallowing the last glow of sun behind jagged cliffs, and Jonas crouched over a meager fire, its flame struggling against the chill that descended with the darkness, each flicker casting uncertain shadows across the sand where Dakota lay. The Apache warrior's breathing was shallow but steadier than before, a faint testament that the crust of bread had done more than merely ease his hunger, it had kept him tethered to life for another night. Jonas's hands trembled as he fed twigs into the flame, and the dry snap of wood echoed louder in his ears than it should have. Coyotes yipped in the distance, their voices sharp and cruel like laughter on the wind, and every cry set Jonas's nerves on edge. He kept his revolver within reach, yet he knew it was a pitiful defense if Dakota's kin came riding in the night. His mind turned in circles, gnawed by questions he could not shake. Had he given mercy or signed his own death warrant? If the Apache lived, would he call his people to finish the job? Or would he remember the bread as a bond between them? The thought twisted inside him, for Jonas had lived too long by the code of suspicion, betrayal, and blood to believe kindness could return anything but pain. Yet as he looked at Dakota's face, half lit by the fire, he saw not an enemy but a man caught in the same merciless grip of survival that had haunted his own steps for years. The wind came sharper now, carrying grit that stung his eyes and cut into his lungs, a reminder that the desert was a harsher judge than any jury or tribe. He thought of the sheriff back in Santa Fe, the bounty posters with his name scrawled across them, and the posse that had hunted him until even his own gang had left him to rot. All of them wanted him dead, yet here he sat, feeding a flame to keep a wounded Apache alive. The irony felt cruel, yet strangely fitting. He poked the fire, sparks rising like lost prayers into the dark, and muttered to himself words he hadn't spoken in years. "Lord, don't let me be a fool tonight." But the desert gave no answer. Only the restless whisper of wind through the scrub and the hungry cry of scavengers circling closer. Jonas pulled his coat tight and settled against a rock, revolver balanced on his knee, eyes darting between the firelight and the shadows beyond. He could not sleep, for every rustle felt like a footstep, every gust of wind like breath on his neck. And still, the doubt gnawed harder than hunger. Was this mercy a spark that could kindle redemption, or was it the torch that would draw his executioners out of the dark? In that long night of uncertainty, Jonas sat a prisoner of his own choices, watching the flame burn low, waiting for dawn or death. The first pale fingers of sunlight crawled over the horizon, bleeding gold across the desert. And for a fleeting moment Jonas thought perhaps he had survived the night unscathed, that maybe fate had forgotten him after all. But then the ground began to tremble beneath his boots with a low, rolling thunder that did not belong to the sky. At first, he thought it might be a trick of his starving senses, some cruel echo of hunger and exhaustion. But as the tremor grew, dust began to rise in columns from the canyon mouth, curling skyward like smoke from a giant's fire. His heart seized, and he knew what it was before his eyes confirmed it. Hoofbeats, a tide of them, pounding in rhythm with the earth itself. Jonas staggered to his feet, revolver in hand though he knew its weight was useless, and squinted into the blinding sun as the horizon shifted, alive with motion. Out of the canyon they came, a storm of horsemen, Apache riders swarming like shadows broken loose from the stone, their banners whipping, their cries carried on the wind though their mouths gave no sound yet. 500 strong, a living wall of vengeance, moving with the precision of a storm rolling across the plains, their approach so absolute that even the desert air seemed to tighten in his lungs. His gaze darted to Dakota, still lying weak near the embers of the fire, and dread surged like poison in his veins. Would Dakota's people see the mercy he had given, or only the outlaw standing over their wounded kin with a revolver in his hand? He could already feel the circle tightening before they had reached him, the desert shrinking with every thunderous beat of hooves, until he was nothing more than a lone man stranded on a barren stage, the fury of a nation closing in. The dust stung his eyes, filled his mouth, and turned the sky into a haze of choking red, yet he could not look away from the sight. 500 Apache warriors riding as one, their silhouettes rising like specters from the storm, each face unreadable, each arrow and rifle a promise of swift reckoning. Jonas's heart pounded so fiercely he thought it might burst, but he stood rooted, trapped between the instinct to flee and the futility of resistance. He had seen death before, had dealt it with his own hands, but never had he felt its presence descend so completely, like the desert itself had chosen to swallow him whole. The fire at his feet sputtered, Dakota stirred faintly, and the outlaw whispered to himself through clenched teeth, "This is it, Jonas. This is where the trail ends." Yet even as terror coiled in his chest, another thought slipped through, quiet but undeniable. If death was coming, it was not for the bread he had eaten, but for the bread he had given. The thunder of hooves gave way to an eerie stillness as the riders fanned out in a great circle, their horses stamping the earth in unison, dust swirling like smoke around Jonas, until he felt as if the desert itself had closed its fist around him, leaving no space to run, no breath to spare. 500 eyes bore into him, dark and sharp as obsidian, bows drawn taut, rifles gleaming in the slant of morning light, every warrior poised between silence and the promise of death. Jonas's hand twitched toward the revolver at his hip, the cold iron pressing against his ribs like a curse, but even as his fingers brushed the grip he knew it was folly. 6 bullets could not stand against a tide of 500. His stomach twisted, his knees weak from hunger and fear, but he forced himself to stand straight, chest rising with the defiance of a man who had already lived too long under death's shadow. Then movement stirred within the mass of riders, a shift like wind across prairie grass, and Jonas saw Dakota, no longer sprawled in the dust but lifted high upon a horse, his body supported by the strong arms of his people. The warrior looked pale, his wound still raw, yet his head was held upright, his eyes fierce though glazed with pain, and all around him murmurs rose like the low growl of thunder. Jonas's breath caught as those murmurs grew sharper, as if the entire circle pulsed with one heartbeat, a force larger than any lawman or posse he had ever faced. He wanted to speak, to explain, to say he had chosen mercy, not malice, but his throat closed on the words, leaving only silence. And in that silence, the weight of their judgment crushed him harder than chains. Every rider seemed carved from stone, their faces unreadable yet burning with intensity. And Jonas felt naked before them, a single outlaw stripped of excuses, his life hanging by a thread woven from bread and dust. The revolver grew impossibly heavy, dragging at his hip until it felt as though it might pull him into the ground, and still he did not move, caught between surrender and defiance, knowing either could be his final act. The horses snorted, stamping, restless, their riders unblinking, and time stretched into an unbearable rope drawn tight. Then Dakota raised a hand, weak but deliberate, and though no words passed his lips, the motion was enough to hold the entire storm in check. The silence deepened, thicker than the desert heat, more suffocating than the dust choking the air. And Jonas understood that the eyes of 500 men, women, and children weighed more than bullets or gallows. They would decide his fate, not by law, not by steel, but by what they saw in the heart of a man who had given his last bread to an enemy. And in that moment, under the crushing stillness, Jonas wondered if mercy would prove a salvation or his final crime. The circle of riders parted like a tide breaking against stone, and from within the mass emerged the elders, chiefs whose very presence seemed to still the restless stamping of horses and hush the whispers that drifted like wind across the desert. Their faces were carved by time and burden, eyes dark wells that had seen too much blood, too much betrayal, too many promises broken by men who looked like Jonas. Yet they rode forward with a majesty that made the outlaw feel smaller than the dust beneath their horses' hooves. Jonas stood rooted, the revolver still heavy at his hip, his throat parched not only from thirst but from the unbearable weight of what he could not say. As the leaders of Dakota's people halted before him, their stares cutting into him sharper than any blade. One spoke, his voice low yet resonant, in words Jonas could only partly understand. But the meaning was plain. Why would a white outlaw, a man marked by violence, a stranger whose hands bore the stains of blood and theft, choose to save an Apache warrior instead of finishing him beneath the sun? The question hung in the air like a noose waiting for a neck, and though Jonas's lips parted, no sound escaped. What could he say? That guilt gnawed at him like a rat, that he was too tired of killing to pull the trigger one more time, that he had seen in Dakota's dying eyes a reflection of his own? The words stuck, trapped between shame and fear, and so he stood in silence, the fire of judgment burning hotter than the desert sun on his back. His silence grew heavier with each passing breath, until it seemed to stretch out and wrap itself around the entire gathering, filling the air with a tension no rifle or arrow could match. The chiefs studied him, their faces unreadable, yet their eyes searching for something beneath the outlaw's ragged exterior, and Jonas felt as though every sin he had ever committed was laid bare before them. The banks he had robbed, the men he had shot, the friends he had betrayed when the law closed in. He wanted to defend himself, to insist he was not beyond redemption, but every attempt died in his chest, leaving only the hollow truth he was too weary to fight, too burdened to plead. His silence was no shield, no clever deflection, but in that silence something raw slipped free. Sincerity, unadorned by excuses, naked in its frailty. The desert wind shifted, tugging at his coat, rattling the beads and feathers that adorned the chief's garments. And Jonas felt as though the earth itself waited with bated breath. He lowered his eyes, not in submission but in quiet acknowledgement, a man who had no defense left but the weight of his silence. And in that moment, though he had said nothing, the truth spoke louder than any words. This outlaw was not begging for his life, nor denying what he was, but standing as a man too worn to lie anymore. For a long moment after the chief's question, silence hung over the desert like a shroud, thick and suffocating, broken only by the restless snort of horses and the distant cry of a hawk wheeling high above. And Jonas stood as though carved from stone, his lips pressed tight, his shame and weariness speaking louder than any defense he could muster. when suddenly a new sound cut through the heavy air, the ragged, strained voice of Dakota. It was faint at first, a whisper carried on the wind, but it grew with each word until the hush of 500 riders bent toward him, listening. Dakota sat slumped against the horse that bore him, his body weak and trembling, yet his eyes burned with the stubborn fire of a warrior who refused to be silenced. His words, though broken by pain, carried with them the weight of truth. He spoke of how the outlaw, this man Jonas whom they now encircled with steel and fury, had found him on the edge of death beneath the burning Sunday. He told of the moment when hunger and fear might have driven any other white man to finish him, to leave his body for the coyotes. Yet Jonas had done the unthinkable. He had given away the last of his bread, the only lifeline he had left, to a man he should have called his enemy. Each word Dakota forced from his throat was like a stone cast into still water, ripples spreading through the assembled ranks, breaking the rigid silence. Murmurs began to stir, low at first, then rising like the hum of a storm building in the distance. Some faces hardened in suspicion, others softened with curiosity, and the balance of judgment shifted like sand beneath a boot. Jonas felt every eye turn upon him anew, no longer only with fury but with something sharper, more complicated. Doubt, wonder, the faintest trace of respect. He could see it in the way certain riders lowered their bows ever so slightly, in the way the chiefs leaned toward Dakota, listening with solemn gravity. The outlaw's heart hammered, not with the blind terror of a trapped beast, but with something different, fragile, terrifying in its own right, the possibility of hope. Dakota's voice cracked, his breath rattling, but still he pressed on, insisting that Jonas had not come with cruelty, had not drawn his revolver, but had chosen mercy when no one was watching, when no law compelled him, when only the desert wind could bear witness. At last his words faltered, his body sagged, and he nearly slipped from the saddle, but the warriors at his side held him steady, their own expressions now shaded by the story he had spoken. The murmurs swelled, then quieted again, leaving in their wake a charged silence that was no longer filled only with threat. Suspicion had not vanished, it still burned in the eyes of many, but something had been cracked open, something that could not be ignored. Jonas stood at the center of that storm, breathing hard, knowing that for the first time, the truth of another man's voice might weigh heavier than the sins of his own past. The decision came without words, only with the sharp motion of a hand from one of the elders, and in an instant Jonas felt rough hands seize him, twisting his arms behind his back, rope biting into his wrists, as though the desert itself had decided he would not walk free. Yet, though the warriors could have ended him there beneath the rising sun, no blade pierced his flesh, no bullet was fired, and he realized he had been spared but not forgiven. They placed him between riders, a prisoner with no dignity left, and as the circle broke apart, 500 strong began their slow procession back toward the heart of their land, carrying Dakota and dragging Jonas along. Dust rose thick around them, stinging his eyes, and every jolt of the horse beneath him reminded him of the rope cutting deeper into his skin. Hours passed, the desert stretching endless and merciless, until the shapes of the Apache camp emerged on the horizon, a sprawl of hides and poles, smoke curling skyward from scattered fires, the air alive with a rhythm of survival Jonas had never seen so close. As they entered, the camp shifted around him like a living wall. Mothers pulled their children behind them, eyes wide with suspicion and fear, while old men watched with stony silence, their faces unreadable masks carved by hardship. Warriors moved with the precision of a blade, never lowering their guard, their hands always near their weapons as though expecting Jonas to spring into violence at any moment. The outlaw's chest tightened, not from hunger this time, but from the sheer weight of being inside a world he had only ever glimpsed from the other end of a rifle. He smelled the pungent tang of hides being cured, the sweetness of corn roasting, the faint bitter smoke of herbs carried on the wind, all blending into a tapestry that spoke of a people who endured against everything the frontier threw at them. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts, their small eyes filled not with hate but with an innocence that pierced Jonas's heart in a way no bullet ever had, and he found himself lowering his gaze, ashamed to meet them as though his sins could be read plain on his face. Dakota was borne gently past him into one of the larger lodges, women rushing forward to tend his wounds, their movements swift and practiced, and Jonas, watching this, realized he was seeing love carved out of hardship, a strength not of guns or violence but of bonds unbroken by years of struggle. Every detail struck him harder than the ropes around his wrists. The way warriors sharpened blades with patient precision, the way elders sat in quiet council, the way laughter of children rose even in the shadow of suspicion. Fearsome, yes, but also achingly beautiful. And Jonas felt an ache in his chest deeper than hunger or fear, the dawning knowledge that he was walking not into death alone but into a chance to see the world as it truly was, stripped of the lies he had carried all his life. Jonas woke each morning to the sharp crack of dawn and the relentless stares of the warriors who kept him bound not by rope alone but by the invisible cords of suspicion. And though no man raised a blade to him, every glance reminded him that he lived at the mercy of those who could decide his fate with a single nod. They gave him no weapon, no freedom, only tasks that tested the measure of his spirit, fetching water from the river with heavy clay jars that bruised his shoulders, tending horses whose wild eyes watched him as though they sensed both his fear and his longing, carrying firewood under the gaze of children who whispered questions he could not understand but felt deep in his bones. At first, bitterness rose in him like bile, for he was no servant, no slave to be ordered about. Yet as the days unfolded, he began to see something in the rhythm of those simple duties, something he had forgotten in years spent clutching a gun and running from the weight of his own sins. The horses calmed beneath his touch, their dark hides warm against his calloused palms, and he felt in their quiet acceptance a strange sense of trust. The water he carried cooled his lips as he bent to drink, a gift sweeter than whiskey, purer than anything he had tasted in his wandering. Even the silence that wrapped around him once suffocating became a kind of teacher, forcing him to hear the sounds he had long ignored, the crackle of fire, the murmur of mothers soothing children, the low hum of elders speaking into the night. He felt the judgment in every pair of eyes, yes, but he also felt something more elusive, a patience that seemed to ask not for excuses but for proof through action. And so Jonas set his jaw, carried the burdens laid upon him, and in doing so discovered a part of himself long buried beneath years of blood and dust. Nights brought him to the fire, where he sat apart yet near enough to catch fragments of stories told in a language he could not follow, but whose cadence carried the weight of sorrow and pride, of battles fought and loves lost. In those voices he heard echoes of his own story, though spoken in tones far nobler than his. For the first time in years, he felt the absence of the revolver at his side not as a loss but as a strange relief, a space where something else might grow. Still, the weight of judgment pressed upon him with each sunrise, for he knew every movement was measured, every silence noted, and though no verdict had yet been spoken, he sensed the trial was already underway, unfolding not in words but in the quiet ledger of his deeds. And as he lay down each night, beneath a sky vast and merciless, Jonas wondered if mercy itself could become the rope that either freed him or pulled him to his death. The first time it happened, Jonas thought it was a mistake, some childish impulse with no meaning behind it. But as the small hand slipped the delicate stem into his palm, the outlaw felt the weight of it like no bullet he had ever carried. A wildflower, fragile and bright, pressed against the cracked leather of his skin, its petals trembling in the desert breeze as if it had no business surviving in such a merciless land. Yet there it was, offered to him by a child with eyes wide as the sky, neither hardened by suspicion nor sharpened by anger but filled instead with simple curiosity and an innocence Jonas had long forgotten existed. He stared at the bloom, rough fingers curling around it as though afraid it might vanish, his throat tightening as the world around him swayed in contradiction, 500 watchful eyes weighing his every move. And yet here, in this small gesture, he was given something no trial or counsel had ever granted, a chance at being seen not as an outlaw or enemy, but simply as a man. That night, as the fire crackled low and the camp filled with songs that rose into the dark, songs threaded with sorrow for the dead and pride for the living, Jonas sat apart but listened, his heart stirring with every cadence that spoke of grief and endurance, a history carved not in ink but in blood and bone. The voices carried through the air like the desert wind, untranslatable yet deeply understood, weaving stories of battles lost, loved ones mourned, and victories won not in conquest but in survival itself. Each note seemed to press against the cracks in Jonas's chest, filling places he had kept hollow for years, and for the first time he felt kinship in suffering, recognizing in their pain an echo of his own guilt, the endless running from sins that still clawed at his conscience. He looked across the fire and saw Dakota, bandaged and pale but sitting upright among his people, the firelight catching the determination in his eyes. And Jonas knew without words that the warrior's life was not his alone to claim or to spare. It belonged to this people, to their memory and their endurance. And by sparing him, he had unwittingly tied himself into that same memory. Mistrust still lingered in the glances of the warriors, still tightened in the hands that hovered near weapons. But something softer threaded through the silence now, something almost like reluctant respect. They saw him fetch water without protest, tend horses without malice, carry burdens without complaint. And perhaps most of all, they saw that he remained, that he had not tried to flee into the desert night even when shadows stretched long and watchmen's eyes drifted heavy. The flower lay tucked in his pocket, a small symbol of a bond unspoken, and as he touched it beneath the fabric, he felt it root deeper than he wished to admit. Jonas realized then that survival was not only about outlasting death or escaping the noose, it was about finding a place, however unlikely, where his heart might stop running. And as the song swelled and the fire burned low, he let the sound fill him, not as an intruder, but as a man standing on the fragile edge of belonging. The day of reckoning came with no warning. No whisper carried through the camp. Only the sudden presence of two warriors at Jonas's side as he tended to the horses, their faces as unreadable as stone, their hands firm as they guided him toward the council fire that blazed in the heart of the village. The air carried the smell of smoke and pine, the murmurs of the people gathering, mothers pulling their children close, elders standing in a solemn ring, and Jonas felt the weight of 500 eyes upon him once more, pressing him down harder than shackles ever could. His heart thudded against his ribs, each step heavy as though he were walking toward the gallows, and yet he forced himself to keep his chin level, his shoulders square, for he would not meet death cowering. At the fire sat the chiefs and elders, their faces lit in the flicker of flame, their silence deep as the desert night, and Jonas stood before them unbound, though no rope was needed to remind him he was still a prisoner. He thought of all the days spent hauling water, tending fires, carrying burdens not his own, and how each act had been measured like drops in a scale that might yet tip toward death or mercy. Now the final measure had come. One of the elders spoke, his voice low and resonant, carrying the gravity of centuries. Jonas had been spared once, but no man lived in the shadow of another's mercy forever. The time had come to decide death for an enemy, exile for an intruder, or belonging for a man who had shown he could walk with their people. The words struck Jonas like stones, and though he longed to speak, his tongue was thick, his throat dry. What could he say to plead for a life he had already wasted? He bowed his head, waiting for the judgment that would seal his fate, when a sound broke the hush, the uneven steps of Dakota. Supported by two young men but standing on his own, the wounded warrior came forward, his face pale, yet his eyes burning like the fire itself, and with a voice still ragged from pain but fierce with conviction, he declared that Jonas was no enemy. He told them all how Jonas had given his last bread, how he had chosen mercy when none watched, how he had carried himself in silence but with dignity, bearing the weight of his trial without complaint. His words rippled through the crowd, stirring like wind across the prairie, and though doubt still lingered, it was met with the quiet nods of those who had seen the outlaw labor, who had seen children slip flowers into his hand, who had watched him live without a weapon at his side. Silence fell after Dakota spoke, a silence so deep it seemed the earth itself held its breath, until at last the elder nodded once, and the people echoed with acceptance, not with cheers, not with triumph, but with the solemn weight of recognition. Jonas felt his chest loosen, his breath tremble, for the first time in years tasting not freedom bought by running, but redemption earned by staying, and in that firelit circle he saw a future he had never dared to imagine, a life not chained to the sins of his past but bound to the mercy he had given and the hope he had found.